For those of you who are on the call, thank you for coming on the call. Several of you I have invited on with a video. If you're ever on the call and you think, why am I not on with the video, just email me and we'll set you up. But I think it's always important to have many people on with the video so that we realize, for better and for worse, we are absolutely in this together. I'm Leslie Vinjamori. I direct the US and Americas program at Chatham House. I'm also Dean of our Academy. It's a great honor to have Robert Zoellick speaking today as part of our Chatham House Global Trade Policy Forum, which is one of our absolute key initiatives for our centenary. I'm sure you all know that 2020 is our centenary year. It isn't the year that any of us imagined it would be, but I think for better and worse, it's certainly it's a moment that takes us right back to 1920. Not to say that it's the same, but it certainly reminds us that Chatham House is absolutely essential for thinking through the biggest, most fundamental challenges at a moment when it's far from certain how one gets out of it. I think 1920, we had another 25 years ahead of us really to resolve the challenges of the day as it turned out. So I think we can give ourselves a grace period. The Global Trade Policy Forum is our founding partner is AIG. I'd like to thank AIG. We also have Clifford Chance, Ernst & Young, and Diageo as very important partners. We couldn't do it without you. Please stay with us. It really matters a lot, especially right now. Bob Zoellick, when I was speaking with Marianne Petzinger, who really is the guiding light behind the Global Trade Policy Forum, she's really made it happen for us. And I said, you know, really, I'd love to hear Bob Zoellick speak. Obviously, she was very much on board. As we all know, Bob was president of the World Bank from 2007 to 2012. He was Deputy Secretary of State in the United States, obviously 2006, and US Trade Rep from 2001 to 2005. And before you all came on the call, I said, Bob, what was China's share of global GDP when you sort of took on this challenge in 2001? And he said around 4%. And we're at around 15, 16% now. So, you know, the world has changed, China has changed. And as we all saw the news today, for the first time, we're predicting a year-on-year decline in China's GDP of around 6.8%. Not surprising, but the first time in 4 decades. So not surprising in light of the world that we live in, and China certainly won't be the only one. The last thing I'll say, today's talk is of course based on Bob's recent article in the National Interest, the China Challenge, and it takes us back, Bob, to that moment in September 2005 when you gave your now very famous speech when you encouraged China to come into the system as a responsible stakeholder, something that we have continued to discuss globally and will continue to discuss. I cannot imagine a more important time to have you speak to us about China's role in the world than today. So thank you very much, and please, over to you.
Well, thank you, Leslie, for the invitation and for Miriam's work with this project. And as we mentioned, I got to know Robin many years ago, and Jim O'Neill, your chairman, but also for all the people taking time to take part in this. I know this is a trade policy forum, and I'd be happy to try to address some of those questions. But since China is such a hot topic, I thought I'd open with a key question, which is, can the United States and China cooperate, even though they're competitors, even though they represent different political systems, and even though we're in a period of extraordinary and increasing acrimony? So to get us going, I'll make 5 points. 1, when President Xi assumed office in 2012, he prepared a documentary film about the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Now, and he had all party cadres, about 88 million people, watch the documentary film. Now, if you created such a film in Britain or in continental Europe, Gorbachev would be the hero that helped end the Cold War. The Chinese version of this documentary turns out a little bit different. Gorbachev is the person, the fool, who abandoned the Communist Party, ruined his country, led to breakup and disaster. And the not so subtle message is, it won't happen here. The fall of the Soviet Union still casts a very large shadow over China. And if President Xi had been unable to shut down COVID-19, it would have been a very serious danger to the Communist Party's legitimacy. It's always important to keep this in mind because political and economic systems obviously interact, and this is the key aspect of China today. Given a sense of history, Xi and his colleagues are very alert to the fact that in the history of empires and dynasties in China, disease, famines, crises often signal the end of a dynasty. I think in contrast now, Xi probably feels that China has missed the bullet and has had relative success. Second point, so how is China approaching its position internationally? I use the term globalization with Chinese characteristics. And I focused on two tracks. One track, which the debate over the WHO is highlighting, is to work within the existing international institutions, the international financial institutions, the WTO, the WHO, the ITU, the various UN agencies, and try to push them towards Chinese interests and norms. Frankly, this shouldn't be a surprise. And from a US perspective, the question is you can't fight something with nothing. So if you don't like that approach, the challenge will be how will the US counter it within those institutions. But there is a second track worth noting, and this is one that Evan Feigenbaum at the Carnegie Endowment first brought to my attention, but I'll share with you. And that is China's diplomacy has had a tradition of tributary states, looking at the world in terms of hierarchical relations. And under the tributary system, states would get benefits and they would receive advantages as long as they showed respect to China. Today, that certainly means no criticism of the Chinese Communist Party. And Belt and Road is a good example of this because it fits the infrastructure-led development that China has used. Third point, US politics in China today. Trump's style with China, as well as many others, has been one of confrontation. Prior to the coronavirus, his focus was really the bilateral trade deficit. This led him to the package that they completed shortly before or at the time of the coronavirus in January. I've written about this elsewhere. I think there's very questionable results. It is a purchase package. There's much less attention to the rules. Now, beyond Trump, and you can see this actually in the news today, other Republicans have joined the chorus for various reasons. You can criticize human rights in China, its internal policies, its external behavior, security, economics, the Wuhan virus. The strategic objective of this criticism is a little vague. Is it decoupling or what's to be accomplished? Particularly in an election year, the Democratic response is not going to be all that different because they don't want to be seen as soft on China. The newspapers here in the US have reports of how some of the early ads now against Biden are the Beijing Biden. So the Democrats have to make sure they don't look soft on China. In general, the Democratic Party has been more protectionist than Republicans, so that fits with a number of the members of Congress. I suspect the Democratic position would be more multilateral, but it would still be fuzzy. Interestingly, and there's some data from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs that just highlighted this, younger Americans, particularly millennials, have a less hostile attitude and more recognizing the need to cooperate. But as you in London or in continental Europe look at this, expect that this to be a key part of Trump's campaign, and it'll get worse over the course of 2020. Fourth point, as part of this debate on China, there's a new conventional wisdom that has crept into foreign policy articles and foreign policy thinking. And at essence, it's that past efforts at cooperation with China failed. You mentioned the article I wrote in the National Interest. One reason I did was to highlight whatever you think of China today, that assertion is flat wrong. And I think it's very dangerous to base your policy on inaccurate readings of the past. And without going through all the details, but just to give people a flavor, in 1950, 53, or 51 to 53, China was a wartime enemy of the United States. It then, through surrogates with North Korea and Vietnam, also engaged in kinetic war with the United States. We've seen a turn, particularly starting in the 89 and 90 and 90 after Tiananmen Square, that on an issue such as proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and missiles, that China became a cooperative partner. China cooperated with the United States in dealing with proliferation issues in Iran and North Korea. If you go back and you look at UN Security Council resolutions from 2000, there was about 190 that dealt with security and sanctions issues. China was in support of the US position 182 times. Now, those often required very sensitive negotiations to reach a result, but a little different than the idea that there cannot be cooperation with China. China is quite active with UN peacekeeping. In the mid-2000s, I was very active with the issues on genocide and fighting in Darfur. I actually brought the Chinese into that process, and they were quite constructive. On the economic side, as Jim O'Neill knows, since he's the author of BRICS, China has been the most significant contributor to global growth. Its current account surplus, which at one point was 10%, is actually reduced about to 0 to this year, which all that would add to global demand. Until some of the Trump policies, China was the fastest growing destination for US exports over 15 years. It no longer manipulates exchange rate. During the global financial crisis, when I was at the World Bank, China gave the biggest stimulus program. It was quite a cooperative partner with the IMF, the World Bank, and others. Even the much debated WTO accession. If you look at the details, China's commitments to the WTO were much more extensive than other developing countries, such as Brazil and India. And if you look at the numerical commitments, they did pretty well in keeping it. The challenge has been on some of the harder to measure topics, such as enforcement of intellectual property. On climate change, certainly Beijing has recognized the importance of the issue. If there's melting in the Himalayas, this will be an ecological disaster for China. They've been quite in the forefront of some of the technological innovation. But at the same time, if you look at the coal-fired electricity generating plants, there are big challenges ahead. I've been very active in the conservation community, and China created a lot of stir when it banned elephant ivory. The netizen community in China rose up against shark fin soup. I've also worked with trying to preserve the 3,700 tigers left in the world. China has not taken the steps that I would like on that area, but it shows there's some advances in some of these topics. On the sensitive issue of use of force, other than with Vietnam in 1980 and some dust-ups in the Spratlys, China has actually been restrained in use of force. Relations with Taiwan, which have been sensitive, nevertheless, if you go back to the diplomatic accounts of Kissinger and Nixon in the early 70s and ask whether you would expect to have a democratic Taiwan separate from Beijing today after 50 years, not sure that would have been the assumption at the point. Now, my point is not to give accolades to China. My point is we shouldn't take these aspects of cooperation or restraint for granted. It could be very different. Now, it's also the case that not all is well with China. We have many complaints about China, and I have them as well as others. But frankly, my point is that there's no holidays from diplomacy. And a key point is cooperation with China can produce results. Finally, can the US focus on its interests and also stand for its values with China? I believe we can. The starting point is to identify the problems and, of course, customize approaches. So again, in the article you mentioned, I just highlighted 5 on my list. One is a whole series of topics related to trade reciprocity and rules. Then there's a separate but related topic of state capitalism. It's similar because it deals with questions of subsidization, but it creates political anxiety about whether private companies can compete with state companies. As many on this call probably are well aware, there's been a lot of work done, including at the Peterson Institute in Washington. It actually points out the state companies in China do not perform so well, so they're actually a poor use of Chinese capital. A third one will be the efforts of China to dominate technologies of the future. I think that may be the most sensitive one. There's Belt and Road, which I mentioned. Is it a development program? Is it a geopolitical move? Is it a way to use excess capacity in Chinese industries? I suspect it's all of the above. And clearly under President Xi, China has been more aggressive in foreign and security policy. Now, without getting into all the details of these, I think one can at least reason that higher tariffs are not likely to match very well with dealing with those problems, and indeed they haven't. There's also another level, which is if we don't figure out a way to cooperate with China, how will we deal with pandemics? How will we deal with climate change? How will we deal with proliferation, the health of the international economy? My approach has always been to try to work with your allies and partners, also find some interest within China. They are there, various reformers that would support some of the changes that you have. So the question is not just, do we dislike China? The question is, what are you going to try to do to achieve results? So you mentioned my service from 2001 on. I also served with Secretary James Baker at the end of the Cold War at the Treasury and the State Department. That was another tumultuous period. We didn't just make pronouncements. We tried to figure out how to reach a result that was good for us and others. I also believe that the US can and should stand up for its values. Trump has actually done very little of this. It actually starts at home. The best way we can stand up with our values is our own example. But I'll give you another historical one. In the 80s, when Ronald Reagan pushed for his view of the end of the Cold War, he spoke about the aspirations of the Russian people. He talked about freedom, religion, openness. He did not hesitate to make the points about differences, but at the same time, he tried to cooperate with Gorbachev. I think this is very possible for the US or Britain or others to do. We can express our positions on Hong Kong or Taiwan or Xinjiang, and we can get into that. But at the same time, we can listen, we can treat China with respect, and we can try to find common ground. And let me just give you a personal anecdote that expresses some of this. When I was at the World Bank and I made my visits to Beijing, I always would try to go out to see other provinces to get a better sense of China, of some of the poor areas. But when I would come back to Beijing, I would hold a press conference in the World Bank offices. And not surprisingly, they were very well attended by the Chinese media, who would not find such a frank and open government official in their own system. Near the end, we produced a report called China 2030, which was to look at the structural and other reforms that China needed to move from middle-income success to a high-income society. We did it actually with the Chinese authorities, including Liu He, today the deputy premier. So we had a press conference. And during the course of the press conference, I had something that I think most Chinese officials had not encountered, which is a demonstrator stood up and started to scream about what we said on state-owned enterprises. So the security guards, not surprisingly, started to go after the fellow, and I stopped him. And I think I surprised the demonstrator by saying, no, please ask your question. I'll be happy to answer it. And all the Chinese press were just stunned by this approach. And he made some comments about state-owned enterprises, and I tried to respond to them in a fair and reasonable way. It's a small story, but it's a larger point, which is you're still dealing with a big debate in China that we often don't see in the press about people's reactions to the Communist Party authority. I think the best way that the US and others can shape the future thinking in China is by showing our own principles and standing up to the ideas of an open society. I'll close with one other point. When people decide that they want to have a confrontational approach with China, in my years of diplomacy, I've had to take confrontational positions on many topics with different countries. I've been part of wars and peace, but be aware of the consequences of breakdown. If you really want to have a decoupling with China, this would be deeply destabilizing and dangerous for the world system. So think through steps 2 and 3 as well as your first one.
A lot there. Thank you very much. And I'm going to ask the very first short question, but you can answer it after you've taken Mervyn Davies and Jim O'Neill's questions. And my question is, how many of there are you in America? Are you the lone voice, or are there a lot of people like you that might be in positions of power in the next 4 to 8 years, either in Washington or across the private sector or in some other sector of society that will have an influence and an impact? So, you know, what is the scope and the latitude for your way of thinking about China in today's United States? So with that, I'm going to turn over to Mervyn Davies. If you introduce yourself and say your question, you'll have to remember to unmute. I think while we're coming to Mervyn, I'm going to have Jim O'Neill go ahead and begin with his question.
Bob, I'm sitting here in semi-ecstasy with such rational comments being made from somebody that lives in the United States. It's so refreshing. And in the spirit of what Leslie said, well done for still being such a sane human being that's trying to help the world. My question is very specific, but has broader connotations for international cooperation and post-war organizations. And with Trump's remarkable hostility towards the WHO this week, especially ahead of crucial meetings this weekend, is he simply not accelerating the relative decline of the United States in whether it be the WHO, the IMF, World Bank, and so on?
So Leslie, do you want me to answer these two questions?
Is Mervyn with us? And if not, we'll come straight back to you. Mervyn,
I'm on.
Please, go ahead.
Mervyn, how are you?
Great to see you.
Well, I really wanted to build on what Jim just said. It just feels as if the dislocation is increasing, and you know, the blame game on the virus is just going to be extraordinary. So I'm just interested in Robert's perspective on what does that mean for trade?
Before you answer, let me also take a question from my colleague, Marianne Petzinger, who absolutely deserves to be able to ask a question in the first round. Marianne, if you introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you, Leslie. I'm Marianne Petzinger, Senior Research Fellow in the US and Americas program and leading on the Chatham House Global Trade Policy Forum. And Bob, this was tremendous. I guess my question builds on the last one and also the point you made about decoupling being dangerous. But during these times of COVID-19, I mean, there are increasing calls in the United States to kind of focus on autarky, get strategic autonomy, and actually, you know, get supply chains out of China, diversify, but also build a manufacturing base increasingly in the United States again. What do you think the prospects for that are? And what does it mean for globalization in general?
Over to you, Bob.
Okay, so first to start with your question, are there lots of people like me? That must be a trick question. I would have to. I think in policy terms, the views that you heard me express are definitely a minority in the United States. And one of the benefits of my my service is I get to be a contrarian, and I've had to spend many months and years trying to work out pluralistic positions. Now I can just express my own. Let me, however, distinguish some different communities. The key community in the U.S. that supported relations with China over past decades was the U.S. business community. And part of the decline was that leaders in the U.S. business community became increasingly frustrated with some of the issues in China in that first category. The reciprocity, the forced technology transfers, intellectual property rights, very similar to, by the way, that you would have seen listed in some of the European Chamber of Commerce report in Beijing which, by the way, their work is extremely good. It's headed by a German, I believe, and their documents are probably very similar to what you'd see in the US. However, what I think over the past couple of years, some of the US business community has felt this is going too far, it's too dangerous. A lot of them still make considerable money, as Jim knows, in China. As you see with the different challenges of coming out of this recovery, the Chinese economy remains very important for the US and Europe and others. However, they're afraid to stand up and say that. They will do so through their organizations, but Trump has used the presidential power to batter people that stand up, and so there's a caution, whether you agree with it or not. When I gave a speech before the U.S.-China Business Council, I believe in November, a very, I don't know, 500, 1,000 people, big crowd, which was the basis for that article in the National Interest. I got a standing ovation. Now, I don't think it was just because people wanted to get up and leave and go home from dinner. I think they were glad that someone stood up and said these views. So there are groups within the United States that realize that this is dangerous, even though everybody has legitimate frustrations. I mentioned some of the data about millennials, and actually it's quite interesting. I think, as you know, you have elites in Britain. We don't have them. We have opinion leaders. And the opinion leaders in the US are much more hostile to China. The public was a little bit less so. It moved with some of Trump's trade rhetoric, and then it moved back. So my point is that I think this will be challenging, particularly in a political year. But there are various groups that recognize that a pure confrontational track won't work. I think at the same time, the danger, of course, in an inflammatory environment is if you say anything that supports or explains China's position, then you get to be seen as a panda hugger and you're soft and you can be dismissed. So I'm fortunate I'm able to write relatively regularly with the Wall Street Journal, and it always creates a series of letters that blast me for various things. So I think in the bigger picture, from a position of Britain and Europe, it's important to engage the various US constituencies that do recognize one needs to take a different approach on this. And frankly, there are legitimate complaints about Chinese behavior. So this will be probably the biggest foreign policy issue for the United States over coming decades. And clearly, this election will also be important. As though I said, I think candidate Biden will also be very careful on this topic. To Jim's point about accelerating decline in the WHO, let me take this into two pieces. On the accelerating decline, I'm again a bit of a contrarian on this one. I actually, when I look at the US position globally, and in part this may be a function of experience, I've lived through other periods where people forecast US decline. I frankly don't believe the US is in the state of decline, but one of the reasons why I believe that is because a lot of the discussions focus on government and state power. And the genius of the United States is not the government and state power, it's the private sector and the adaptability and ingenuity of the private sector. And so in one of the pieces I wrote for the Wall Street Journal, and I talked about the response to coronavirus, I said, keep in mind first, institutions other than the White House, for example, the Federal Reserve. So Jim and others on this call would be well aware that the dollar swap program that the US has and in a sense, a repo program have been critical for the financial aspects. If you look at the US military, US intelligence, frankly, other institutions, many of which, by the way, President Trump has sought to undermine, they're a very important underpinning. But then also, if you look at the Gates Foundation or other or private sector businesses and firms, that's I think the resilience of America, and we'll see how that plays out over time. I want to come back a little bit to the WHO since it's such a hot topic, and I worked with the WHO in various capacities at the World Bank. This is a good example of where it's not an issue that you can just frame as yes or no. So start out with the fact that all these international institutions, World Bank, WTO, WHO, they have a governing charter that is sent up by the countries. And the WHO has tended to be a thinner institution. It doesn't have the field work that, for example, some of the UN agencies have that deal with food or some refugees or others. It's a coordinating institution. And by its very own charter, the countries don't want it to have the power to be able to enforce its efforts with them. That's point one. Point two, and this is where a little knowledge of history is important. There was a WHO head, some of you may remember, Gro Brundtland, who had been the Prime Minister of Norway, who actually tried to be more assertive in the role of WHO. And frankly, her experience led to some pushback by some of the member states. And so, not surprisingly, you're going to get leaders of these institutions that are very sensitive to their funding, the powerful states and others, in part to be effective. But this leads me to the third point, and a very underappreciated point about international institutions. It's best to have people in them who recognize you need to engage in diplomacy, but that are also willing to step out and willing to push. So frankly, this is one of the challenges if you have people who come from authoritarian systems or are too sensitive to the idea of those in power. When I was at the World Bank under both the Bush and the Obama administrations, I was prudent in how I do this, but I didn't always take the US position. In fact, publicly, I often took an alternative position. Now, at the same time, since I relied on the Congress for funding, I created a caucus, a bipartisan caucus. And when I needed a capital increase, I got mine a few years ahead of the IMF. So you need to be able to establish your independence in the institution and in the international system. And that requires diplomacy. It also requires, if you're going to take that position, building some support among other countries. So that brings to the next point with the WHO. Clearly, the WHO made some missteps here. It's got some weaknesses. If I were in charge of US diplomacy, I would not be shy to make those points, but I would do them in the context of building a coalition of others that recognize them and put some pressure, for example, on China and the need to have transparent information. And frankly, there'll be people in Beijing that recognize their own weaknesses. If you humiliate them, you're not going to have a hard time getting them to acknowledge it, but they'll do their own retrospectives on how they can try to improve this situation. And I believe that the WHO and others do need to be strengthened. But again, member states have to be honest about, do they really want the WHO to have enforcement powers in the US or Britain or France or others, or can we figure out ways to try to strengthen the coordination and the integrity of the system? That leads to a policy question. You know, if I were in Brussels today, I would actually be thinking about maybe this would be the moment for Brussels, whether with London or with not just China alone, but other member states, to say, okay, we'll make up the difference that the US has left. And here's the key component. I don't know if this is covered in the British press, but the second biggest contributor to the WHO is the Gates Foundation. So I'd go to the Gates Foundation as well, and I'd try to see if they could kick in some extra money. But I would do so with a reform program. And one of the sensitive issues that the administration has raised, I think properly, is Taiwan's observer status. Taiwan was allowed to be an observer before. The Beijing regime turned against that. So I think the trouble with the WHO is kind of, did they do right? Did they do wrong? Trump is clearly trying to use this as a way of distracting and focusing on China. But we do need to keep an eye on how to reform these institutions. But again, I go back to my principle. I like to be effective. I like to get results in doing so. And this current US posturing, I don't think is the way to do that. On the trade and supply chain issues, I'm going to take these together because it gives me an opportunity to point out that as you would expect in the trading system, even before coronavirus, you were having a series of evolutions or adjustments. So one, don't hold me exactly on the data, but if you, from about 1990 to 2008, as I recall, before the global financial crisis, the growth in trade volumes were a little over twice as much as the growth in GDP. From 2008 to about 2019, they actually were about the same or lower than GDP. So you had already had an adjustment to this. Second point, however, the categories had also changed. So manufacturing trade had slipped. Services trade was about up 60%. Depending on what you count, there's services trade was about 20 to 30% of the total. It gets up to almost 50% if you look at intra-company transfers. So clearly you had an increase in services trade. Third point, you've also had different regional integration patterns. These are most obvious in East Asia, where China's changed from just being a commodity importer to having more domestic demand. But you would see clusters in key industries and autos and others being more regionally based. Fourth point, you also saw the nature of the supply chain and logistics change because labor costs were less important in the overall structure than the role of knowledge workers and knowledge industry was. So that was already a changing pattern. And fifth, you also had changes due to technology. So I'm sure your team has looked at this. People had asked whether 3D printing, for example, would change the logistics and supply chain system that had been based on the concept of many components produced over many countries, large batches, integrated across many different countries. 3D printing allows you to have customized, on-site, smaller batches. Interestingly, some of the early studies of this, which looked at hearing aids, found that actually the benefits of increased quality and price strengthened the position of the incumbents. These tended to be, if I recall, Denmark, Switzerland, and Singapore. Because you got increased amount of trade and quality of trade. Now that's a small item. So if you had bigger items, it would change. My point is, it was important to be aware of the changes in trading patterns, which will always occur before the coronavirus. I think after the coronavirus, to go specifically to your question, this will be the big debate. And this will be what Chatham House and others will need to engage on over at least the next 5 to 10 years. Some, as in some in the White House, will say the lesson is we need autarky. We need to produce everything at home. We can't trust on other sources. I said in a different context recently, we tried this in the 1930s. It didn't work so well. We had a current account surplus and 25% unemployment. However, there will be adaptation. So will countries and companies look for diversity in sourcing? Certainly. Will they look for more resiliency and adaptability of their supply lines? Certainly. Will they decide for stockpile and inventories of certain goods? Certainly. These will have costs, but they probably make sense. They don't try to break up the international trading system, which ultimately is benefit for productivity, it's benefit for livelihoods, it's benefit for creating higher paid jobs because of the productivity. And from a narrow US perspective, if you're in an export industry, like farmers and agriculture and ranchers in the United States, if you want to encourage the world to move towards autarky, say food security in every country, then you're really going to be clobbering your own business. And since a lot of this comes back, trade always comes back to politics, remember, under our Constitution, you've got 50 states, each have 2 senators. There's a lot of farm states. That means a lot of farm state senators. So they'd be shooting themselves in the foot.
Just a reminder, we're on the record. We have 160 people on the call and a lot of questions. I'm going to take 4. All right, Bob. Caroline Wilson wrote in her question, but I want her to say her question. So Caroline Wilson, Simon Fraser, Robin Niblett, Steve Erlanger. Caroline, are you with us?
I am. I'm very much with you. Yes.
I know everybody, you're all very well-known people, but there are 160 people on the call, so please do introduce yourself.
I'm unmuted, but I don't think I'm visible. At least I hope I'm not visible, although I'm not wearing anything particularly scandalous. But just to say thank you, Bob. That was an excellent presentation. And on not just making pronouncements, but on delivering results, where would you start? I'm interested to know in particular what real scope you see, for example, in terms of cooperation on global governance, whether digital or economic, environmental, or indeed on international peace and security, not least given P5 practice to date, which is not always encouraging. And another separate question, which you've just touched on really, and really I think you've pretty much answered, which is about the political talk about decoupling, but how realistic and achievable is that in practice? I think you've just told us, but that was another part of my question, not least in a post-COVID world where there is going to be so much negative growth for quite some time to come, I guess. Thank you.
And Caroline with the Foreign Office. So
I am indeed. Thank you.
When you say your name, if you could give us your affiliation. Simon, you're next.
Hi, it's Simon Fraser here. I'm the Deputy Chairman of Chatham House these days. Very nice to see and hear you, Bob. My question was this. We are continually told in Europe now that the hardening attitude towards China in the United States is bipartisan, and you yourself said that. And you said that candidate Biden would be very cautious on that. My question is, leaping ahead, if it were to be President Biden, in what ways might the handling of China policy, and in particular United States relations with its allies in relation to China policy, possibly change? Because the current position is sort of creating turbulence in relations between allies and indeed within our own politics in our own country. And the question is, could the body language change in a way which might help us to come together, even if we are taking harder positions or possibly, in some issues, divergent positions towards China?
Robin.
Robin Iblett, Director of Chatham House. Bob, thank you for sharing these great thoughts, and great to have you with us today. Very quickly, to use time, your mention about the old Chinese tributary system and its way of conducting its relationships with its neighbors. How far do you think China's capacity for a neo-tributary approach, how far could it reach? Is there a risk of a regionalization of trade after this? Because in the end, that tributary influence only gets to a certain distance, maybe broadly in Asia, maybe or maybe not including India. Or is it able to really reach into parts of Europe, for example, or Africa? Do you think that tributary system could lead, therefore, to a greater regionalization of trade? Or is it more likely that it's just where China's influence can reach most directly? I'm just interested to see whether that has a parallel for today or not. Thanks.
Steve Erlanger.
Thank you, Leslie. Steve Erlanger with the New York Times in Brussels. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Steve.
How are you? So listen, a very simple journalistic question, which I hope you'll grapple with. Has this COVID crisis taught you anything new about Xi Jinping's China? Or does it just tend to reconfirm what everybody thinks? Thank you.
I think actually I'm going to take one more while we are on the journalistic question. Mary Dejevsky, I see you on the list. Do you want to add your question now, Mary?
I actually had two, but shall I? The one that's related to Steve is that you mentioned COVID as a danger to Xi Jinping, but one that had maybe passed. Some commentators have actually talked about maybe the threat is actually still waiting for Xi Jinping, in that people in his entourage might be unhappy with the consequences for China, so that his position is maybe not as secure as it currently looks. Thank you.
Robin, you're going to give that one a go?
If I got it right, Mary, I think you were mentioning that is there a risk that Xi Jinping may not be quite as secure as he looks currently, and therefore with his entourage, you're there somewhat at the blessing of the Communist Party as a whole, despite the changes that have happened recently. That's the bit I got at the end, Mary, of your question.
Great. Okay, Bob.
Okay, so on Caroline's question, I'm not sure whether on delivering results the focus was on U.S.-China policy or more broadly. If U.S.-China policy, for the sake of just efficiency, I would focus on those 5 categories that I mentioned about trade, reciprocity and rules, state capitalism, tech dominance, Belt and Road, foreign and security policies. And just for slightly shorthand, I've talked about a little bit of those in this article. I think one would have to have customized approaches in each of these. The way I would do so, and this is quite important given some of the other questions, is to do so in cooperation with allies and partners and internal forces within China. And again, just to give you a small anecdote about this, I was asked, I guess maybe now it was 2 years ago, to speak at the China Development Forum. And I gave a speech where I identified these exact issues. And I tried to come up with some suggestions on how China could engage on them. And I used the Belt and Road as an example. And I explained how the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which I thought could be a useful device as long as it had the right norms and transparency and anti-corruption and other steps, had actually proven to be relatively successful. The leader had actually sort of taken that approach. He hired a number of former people from the World Bank in the process, and it allowed China to show a very valuable contribution. So I said, why not take the same approach for Belt and Road? Why not emphasize the transparency? Why not emphasize anti-corruption, environmental issues? And on that visit, I actually had some very senior Chinese officials said that they shared my remarks with President Xi. The next year at the Belt and Road Forum, President Xi actually embraced a number of these points. By the way, one I mentioned that they hadn't acted on was I pointed out the danger of opaque Chinese debt with a lot of emerging market countries. And I said, look, you guys are not fools. At some point, this will blow up on you, and people will want to know what debt is owed to you, under what terms. I said, get ahead of it, be transparent. And we're seeing that exactly happen sort of right now. Now, Xi makes a speech, that isn't enough. So the question would be, could governments and companies and others work with them on trying to make sure that the words are actually implemented? I use this as just one example in that there are many ways in which I think you can find some common ground, get the benefits, not see all this as a zero-sum concept. Now, Caroline, if you had intended it as a broader approach, I'll just make this comment. I think, and this goes to some of the other questions, look, it will be important for the United States in the future. I'm not sure President Trump will make this move, so it maybe be for other people, to decide, first off, do they want to have a strong North American base? I've been a believer that NAFTA was not just a trade agreement. It's a different concept of the European Union, but my vision was of 500 million people, 3 democracies, energy self-sufficiency and ability to exports, better demographics than the rest of the world, economic integration. Well, Trump has clearly not taken that approach. Prior presidents have. And part of my logic is not just for life in North America. It's the question of if we've got that base, we'll have more influence in the rest of the world. I would then also look to my key alliance relationships. And I'll come back to this a little bit in sort of one of the other questions. And my greatest concern is to the international economic arrangements, which are more fractious. These become the foundation for dealing with other issues of a transnational nature, whether they be climate change or others. So I don't believe the US, I believe that over 70 years after World War II, the United States created, adjusted, adapted what we call an alliance system. It's broader than an alliance system. It has various economic and political developments. It's undoubtedly a system that has to adapt and change. Now and then the United States creates controversy when it pushes issues to the fore, whether people agree or not. But in my experience, that's a very important system. And the absence of it would lead to a very different world. So then going to Simon's question about President Biden with China. I think, Simon, as your question suggested, I think he by his nature, he'd be more likely to work with allies and partners. I think that he early on his campaign made a statement that Trump is now pummeling for, but it may have shown some of Biden's inner sense, which was, he said, come on, he said, we're the United States. You know, let's not go crazy about the fact that China is going to dominate the world. China has a lot of weaknesses. And I think that reflected his own sort of historical perspective, but his belief that if the US handled this properly, it could deal with the strengths of China. And as I've suggested, the United States has a lot of resources. I'm most concerned on the economic topics, and this is perhaps a broader trade discussion, because while the polls suggest that young Democrats, and now Democratic voters are more supportive of trade than Republican voters, but I think much of that is an anti-Trump phenomenon. Younger people, I think, again, are more supportive of trade, but on the other hand, this is a question of intensity of support. I think they recognize the globalization of the world. If I were advising Biden's campaign, I'd be trying to think of a way that I could expand a trade agenda, linking it more with some environmental topics. I think that would be the basis of support going forward. For Robin's very good question about kind of the tributary state notion. The first point is, as we're seeing in the news, the Chinese propaganda and overreach inevitably backfire in many places. So again, from my political experience, normally if your foe is digging a hole, I don't stop them, I let them keep digging. So some of this, I believed, would come back and haunt the Chinese of its own accord. And again, my approach was not to say, well, that's good that China is hurt. My approach would be to say, how could China change its policies to be more constructive? So again, when I was at the World Bank, I thought it was a little cheeky for the United States or Europe to tell the Africans you can't have Chinese investment and trade, particularly given some of our history. But it was appropriate to say to the Africans, look, here are things you have to worry about. Here are things about corruption, transparency. We can help you in terms of developing the capacity. And similarly, to go to the Chinese and say, this will backfire if you don't end up having linkages, hire locals and others. So again, it may be my economics background, but I see a fair amount of win-win capacity if you push people in the right way. Historically, the United States, because of its vantage point, can see and do some of these things, but we're not doing that today. You also, Robin, clearly China can extend beyond its own region. It reaches into Europe and Eastern Europe. It'll reach into Africa. It has entree into sort of Latin America in different fashions. But again, it depends on what the response of the US and Europe and Britain is to these issues. I mean, again, a simple political principle applied to diplomacy, you can't beat something with nothing. So, you know, what posture are you going to take for the US on these things? And this is, again, going back to one of the earlier questions, the United States has enormous strengths here, not just with the government and the institutions, and I hope with our values that we can stand for, but also the private sector institutions and others doing things. So it's a question of how you use it. However, you did make a point that I wanted to come to underscore, which is that I think you will see greater regionalism. It's part of the integration. It was a little bit my point on the trade issue. And here's the downside if the system sort of fragments. I'm always wary of pure historical analogies, but since I posed the sort of the 70-year-old system after 47 to 49, here's an alternative, a world of 1900. A world of 1900 where you have great powers, China, the United States, India over time, European Union on economic issues, unclear on security topics, Russia because of its geography and its sort of energy posture, Japan having to find its place between the United States and China, Britain deciding its future. Now, that's a very different world than the world that we've come used to. You'll likely have more spheres of influence that will partly be regional based. We saw what the world of 1900 led to, although that was a world of primarily European powers in Japan. And so again, the world I've just described is much more difficult for the medium-sized players. A lot of players that actually got the benefit of the system that was created over time. So that's one of the downside alternatives. And again, it goes to my principle of, you know, think about step 2 or 3, or be aware of the fact of if you do fragment the system, what it might lead to. So Steve and Mary's question, I'll take together. Very good questions. I guess I had gotten to know Xi Jinping. He had visited me when I was at the State Department, and when I was out of government, I actually visited him when he was party secretary in Zhejiang province. When he was vice president, I had some private sessions with him. A very telling observation. Shortly after he became president, I was in a small meeting of 2 or 3 Americans, and he didn't have a chance to ask lots of questions. But because I'd worked a lot on Chinese development, I asked, what is your priority for development? And his answer was very revealing. He said the 86.68 million members of the Communist Party. Now, that number is actually higher today. Now, most development experts I talked to would probably not mention their political party as being the key to development. But that was an honest answer because he felt that the Communist Party had been corrupted, weakened, lost its legitimacy, and he was going to strengthen the role of the Communist Party in the system. As undoubtedly you know, this has created tensions. It's on the one hand, among some Chinese public, they like the fact that he's going after corruption. Many of the intellectuals, the university community are feeling more frozen, but will intellectuals have that type of influence? The Chinese political party system is a very opaque system. And so frankly, I don't, maybe others have a sense, but from what I read, it's very hard to know who are kind of the ups and downs of the system. My guess is that Xi has a strong controlling hand. And so I don't think that he's in a fragile position. But as I mentioned quickly in passing, because he's the new emperor, if COVID-19 had really spread like wildfire across China, I think it could have created a danger and risk for him. And I think that's one reason why he came so forcefully to try to control the situation coming out of Wuhan. And my guess is he feels now he's in a relatively good position. We'll see what happens in terms of flowbacks over time. So specifically, Steve, I guess anything new about Xi? I guess I had a reinforced sense about the critical role he has in the Communist Party as a dominating institution, and some of the vulnerability that created for him in the early period of coronavirus. There's a longer term question here, which I also alluded to, which is he's relying primarily on the instruments of state power, the state-owned enterprises, for example. And as I mentioned, some of the work that has been done, for example, at the Peterson Institute, Nick Lardy, suggests that's probably not the strength of China's economy in the future. It's the private sector, it's innovation, which gets less capital, is struggling in the process. That, by the way, is the reverse of the coin of what I think the US strength is.
Bob, I'd really like to take one more round, but we are at time. Do you have time for one more round? Okay, great. Okay, so it's a long round, but so everybody's going to be succinct, but please do say your name and your affiliation. Sherrard, Ignacio, Kate Gibbons, Creon Butler, and Alice Ekman. So Sherrard, you're first.
Great. Bob, thanks so much for an absolutely refreshing talk and all the historical analogies, which are so important. Can I ask you about Huawei, where, as you probably noticed, we have in the UK a group of conservative backbenchers calling for the British government's decision to be reopened on the basis that the COVID crisis proves that China is guilty or not someone we should do business with, and address the arguments from GCHQ, and I think even the NSA, that providing strict security protocols are followed, this can be managed. I'd be very interested to know where you come down on Huawei.
And Ignacio. And again, if you have your affiliation, that would be terrific.
Yeah, Ignacio Garcia Bercero. I'm currently a fellow at Oxford University, previously an official in the European Commission Trade. So I would like, Bob, to come back to what you have said on trade. I think you have highlighted 4 areas which are problematic in terms of trade policy in China: reciprocity, forced technology transfer, subsidies, and SOE reform. How likely it is that China would be ready to take meaningful commitments on those areas? I mean, how likely it is that China, to use your phrase of 2005, acts as a responsible stakeholder in the global trading system?
Kate Gibbons?
Hi, Kate Gibbons, Clifford Chance, and also Chatham House Council member. Thank you. It was an absolutely fascinating discussion. Actually, Simon Fraser asked one of my questions, so my other question will be very brief. And what I'm wondering is whether the current US posturing, as you've described the Trump and also the opinion formers approach, may actually have an upside. Can you imagine any circumstances in which there'll be some benefit from their arguments? I must say instinctively, of course, I completely agree with you.
Creon Butler.
Thanks very much. I'm Creon Butler. I'm head of the Global Economy and Finance Program at Chatham House. And my question is really, what is the chance that things could still go seriously wrong for China? I mean, in the case of the global financial crisis, the Eurozone seemed all right initially, and then we saw one hell of a crisis after about 18 months. And China has the prospect of its external demand plummeting, having to write off BRI debts, possibly even a smoking gun in relation to COVID-19. If that happened, how would China respond, and perhaps how would the US respond?
And then Alice Ekman and actually Anirudh Suresh. Alice.
Hi, my name is Alice Ekman. I'm senior analyst in charge of China and Asia at the European Union Institute of Security Studies, EUISS. Thank you for this fascinating presentation. I have just one short question regarding China and Russia. 5 years ago, we were saying that it's a marriage of convenience, but it seems that it's more than this. There was a rapprochement at several levels between China and Russia. How do you assess this bilateral relation in the COVID era and post-COVID era? Do you see this rapprochement, first of all? Do you see it ongoing, and do you see it materializing at multilateral level? Do you see further cooperation between China and Russia at the UN, but also the SCO and other multilateral frameworks? Thank you very much.
Anira Suresh, and then Ian Bond, and then I promise to stop. It's very hard to leave Ian out because he's so important to us. Anira.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I guess my question, you discuss a lot the goal of integrating China into an American world order. And I'm curious why you think that the US can convince China to come into the fold and play nice. I guess I don't understand why you think China could pursue anything other than its own parallel separate system at this point to challenge the US-led world order. And, you know, any historical arguments that you make about like CDVT, Iran, the UN, peacekeeping efforts, North Korea, were all interesting, but all struck me more as mechanisms for China to build up international credibility in order to eventually like usurp the throne, as opposed to conciliatory or cooperative measures. So I guess I'm curious as to where your optimism comes from.
Ian Bond. Ian, can you?
Yeah, got it. Yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask, I mean, one of America's traditional strengths is its openness. And you've had huge numbers of Chinese students over the last several decades. Is there a limit to that in the current climate? I mean, you know, are there questions being asked about whether some of the technology transfer to China takes place in the heads of the students that the US itself has educated? And do they take anything useful from a US point of view back with them, like the seeds of political evolution?
I think we're there. There have been a very large number of questions, but I think we've certainly given you a very large number of questions. So take your time with them. We're here.
Okay.
Here still, so.
I tried to write them down, but maybe you could also help me if I miss one. So Sharad on Huawei. You're an experienced public official. You worked with intelligence agencies. You know the pros and cons. My basic answer is I don't know for sure. When I was in government and people would come in and bring me dispositive conclusions, maybe it's the contrarian nature. It's surprising it worked as well for me as it did in government, but I would always probe and ask, well, what, you know, trying to make sure that the top line conclusion was based on things below. From questions, from discussions I've had, including with some of the people at GCHQ, this is a rather primitive sense. I have some feeling that there may be some, if you look upon the types of 5G systems as having the sort of last line communication through to the instruments, the towers, and then the communication systems to the towers. There are probably some hardware components that you could, as Britain might have done, sort of test for the security of, and therefore you could have some role in the system. However, I think if you deal with software and think about our own experience with your iPad or your computer, where you're constantly having to download sort of different adjustments to your system, that will be a constant aspect of 5G as I understand it. And that's really not subject to being to monitoring. So my sense is the components that, whether it would deal with software on the towers related to your own systems, that it's a big trade-off and risk in terms of the security of those. I've talked to knowledgeable people about the quality and intelligence of the Chinese government's and Communist Party control over Huawei. I think there's a serious risk. I just don't know the particulars. I will say, since I'm trying to encourage the United States to play a positive role, it is interesting, at least on this one, the prime beneficiary should be two European companies. The United States doesn't have the capacity in this area. For Ignacio's question, how likely is it for China to take sort of meaningful action on this? Look, as in much of diplomacy, you try to figure out whether it's in their own interest. And all I can share with you is that from my experience dealing with China, really starting with Baker in '91, but then in the private sector and then at USTR and the World Bank, there were very smart people in China that recognized the need to open up markets. I worked a lot on the financial market side. They saw this in their own interest. They had their own constituencies, just as the US and Britain or continental Europe does in terms of sort of protectionism. And so I could point to a number of cases where they took the advice or accepted the pressure. I'm not suggesting that you just turn a blind eye to things. I mean, if somebody's stealing your stuff or you've got intellectual property rights, you have to figure out how you're going to safeguard. If you need be, you use your domestic law to slam them. Part of the problem that, at least in the US, people often point to the WTO is they say China's violating the rules. And I say, well, what rules exactly? And they say, well, it should be this. And I said, well, that's nice, but that isn't necessarily the rule. Or you have a problem, like, for example, on technology transfer. That was clearly part of the Chinese Working Party report obligations. However, the problem was companies were unwilling to give the evidence because they were afraid that they would have retribution. So some of this comes back to whether you can build stronger WTO rules. On that, I will just say, again, I had discussions with the Chinese on this over the past couple of years, saying why it's in their interest to develop better rules in combination with Europe, Japan, Canada, others. And the question is whether the United States will play that game. Right now, under this administration, we're not willing to play that game. When you create international rules, just as if you try to debate in a democratic society, you're not going to have perfect results. But the question is, can you keep trying to advance the state of the results? Then the question about, let's see, benefits. Kate's question was benefits from, any benefits from this crisis or the administration's policy, I guess was the issue. Look, on an optimistic side, we live in democratic societies. People identify problems. The Trump administration represents constituencies. Big debate in the United States, how much of this is economic driven, how much of this is identity driven. We live in a political world. People better understand what are some of the motivations and try to address them if you're going to be able to succeed in a democratic system. It's a small point. I partly see my sort of minor role as also pointing out some of the flaws or mistakes or how this hurts the United States, and we'll see how that debate proceeds. In general, part of my frustration with the Trump administration is not only policies or frankly character. It's this fundamental notion about pitting US nationalism versus internationalism. And I'll close with a comment about this. I've just completed a book that'll come out in August about America and the world that looks at US history of diplomacy and foreign policy, starting with Ben Franklin in Paris when we had this unfortunate break with your country. And the history of the US has always been that nationalism and internationalism are two sides of the same coin. And so this idea that we can somehow cut ourselves off and operate in an independent environment was never true from our origin. And the question is how you integrate those together. Then the, things that could go seriously wrong in China. Very important question. We'll see what happens in terms of second round. For those like Jim O'Neill who've watched this closely, you'll see the Chinese stimulus package so far has been very different than it was in the financial crisis, in part because of the debt buildup. And so they're trying to manage that carefully. I've already pointed to the fact that they're relying too much on state-owned enterprises, part of the Communist Party pattern and the sort of the view of Xi. So I guess I'll give you a split decision on this one. My argument has always been that, you know, China isn't 10 feet tall. If you study China and you talk to the leaders, they got a lot of problems to deal with in that country. On the other hand, they've also got a lot of resources. And so compared to other emerging market countries, if they get into problems on debt and other sort of financial issues, I think they have both the resources and the tools and frankly, the technocratic ability and political will to deal with those. So I don't mean to suggest that this is a straight line growth to hegemonic power. I think there's a lot of problems that China has to deal with. However, I don't subscribe to the coming China collapse theory. Absent something that shocks political confidence, like we talked about with coronavirus and Xi and the Communist Party system. Then let's see, China and Russia. I think this is a relationship of convenience. I think that China now has the upper hand, as people know from the history of the Soviet Union and China under Mao. There have always been tensions on this relationship. I think that both share a view that they can use changes to weaken the United States influence. So people use terms like multipolarity, but those have been used since at least the Nixon administration. So in that sense, I think they'll be opportunistic. I think there are some fundamentals, not the least of which is the realities of population and geography, that if you're look at sort of the eastern part of Russia and you look at the population and cross-border migration and other issues, I wouldn't necessarily, if I were in Putin's shoes, feel totally secure with that relationship. So again, one of the benefits of events like this is I can share an anecdote. So here's another one. In 1989, I was with President Bush 41. Early in 1989, after Emperor Hirohito died, we went to the funeral, and President Bush wanted to have a working visit in China. So this was before Tiananmen Square. So we're meeting with Deng Xiaoping, and President Bush was trying to get a sense of what Deng Xiaoping's attitude was towards Gorbachev in China. And Deng Xiaoping starts to put out his fingers like this, and he starts to talk about the story of the mulberry leaf. And I must have been the note taker at the end of the table, so I'm thinking, mulberry leaf, what's this about? And Deng goes on to explain, he said, see, he said, China was like a mulberry leaf. He said, but Russia would eat out as a silkworm each of the sort of parts through his fingers or through the stems of the mulberry leaf. And he said, until one has reconciled with those issues, we'll never be truly at peace with, at that time, Soviet Union, today Russia. So as many of you on this call know, some of these historical views run a long time. Again, even when one thinks about North Korea, one of the chapters of my book deals with Teddy Roosevelt mediating the Russo-Japanese War. So I think that the United States has created opportunities for the two of them. But again, here's another interesting example on the economic side. One that at least Hank Paulson has put in his book. In the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the Russians allegedly approached the Chinese and say, we're holding all these dollars, let's dump the dollars and really undermine the American capitalist system. And the Chinese technocrats said, we don't think this is a very good idea. We're holding 3 trillion of these, not so good to reduce the value. This is partly going to be in relation to the answer to one of the other questions. Part of integrating China in the system is that there are mutual benefits. And China didn't see in 2008, 2009 that would be so much in its interest to undermine the global financial system. Now, so is China taking these steps out of charity or sort of kindness? No, they're taking them out of self-interest. But that's one of the benefits of the integrated system we've created. That goes, so the next question about why do you think China could come into the world order, separate systems, or whether they'll separate systems. Keep in mind, the reason I mentioned the 2-track approach is that I think China is having 2 options here. So the tributary state system and the Belt and Road and some of the things that could follow from coronavirus sort of give it the optionality of having an alternative system. But I think the best answer on why they would work with this world order that the US helped create was it turned out to be pretty good for China in the 20th century. If you think about China's growth and development in the trading system, the financial system, the challenges that China still has ahead, if you think about the security issues. Here's another one I'll give you from I started the first 21st century strategic dialogues with China. And when I talked about Korea, for example, I said, look, let's just imagine someday that Korea unifies. And let's say a united Korea maintains a nuclear weapon. So it has a nuclear weapon, China has nuclear weapons, Russia has nuclear weapons. What do you think that will do to the debate in Japan? So look, China doesn't necessarily have an interest here in trying to have proliferation. And frankly, given its borders with 9 neighbors, the United States is in a far advantaged position in terms of geography. So a lot of the factors that I'm talking about relate to how China and others can benefit from adaptation and security and dynamism in the international system. The challenge, of course, is, as I touched on, there are differences in values. There'll be different interests and perspectives. Now and then, I'm not suggesting the United States doesn't have to take actions with its allies to take deterrence measures, if need be, take threatening postures. But I'm suggesting you need a greater portfolio and mix than just throwing epithets at people. And that's kind of our problem today. Let's see, I got the Chinese students, the openness in Chinese students. That's a very good question. You are describing the situation today. So as you may have read, some of the FBI and others have actually visited American universities, warned them about the Chinese students. So this is a slight variation on your question. You asked about the knowledge they take back. Some of these are concerned about the espionage factors of Chinese students. And so I think it's reasonable for the United States as a security matter to try to be alert to the security risks. However, all these things involve trade-offs. And frankly, again, my experience is that the vast majority of Chinese students come to the United States and they get to see our system and they get to see how does that, or Britain or Australia, and they get to see how does it compare with their system. I think that's to our long run interest. And by the way, even if I were looking at Russia today, one of the differences with the Soviet Union is keeping the integration and ties for sort of people movements. So again, I'm not trying to be starry-eyed about the fact that there aren't risks. You have to measure the risks and you have to have some sense of kind of the alternatives. Also, if you want to build cooperation, since we're talking about coronavirus, I'll give you another example of a Chinese, I serve on the board of Temasek, Sovereign Wealth Fund of Singapore. And one of the leading Chinese officials that works with Temasek on some of the life sciences area explained how he had come to the United States, had got his advanced degrees in life sciences, probably would have been a professor at a university, but his wife wanted to go back to China. And he said there's at least a generation or two like him that have then formed venture capital firms, shared data. This gets to this tricky issue about the technology topics, which by the way, requires another session. That's, I think, going to be the most difficult issue in terms of trying to do the integration. But you would lose the benefits of that. And so, again, where I come down from, and this is sort of ironic given some of the political debate, in some ways I've got more confidence in the United States' resiliency and adaptability that some of the people that constantly feel threatened. On the other hand, I want to manage it in a way that keeps us secure, but also extends our influence globally, starting with your allies and partners, trying to improve institutions like the WHO, trying to manage the cooperation with China. And again, it may just be my practical side. I worked for Baker for 8 years, and every morning it was, what are we supposed to get done, not what press release we issue. We did the press release afterwards. but it's kind of like, what's the alternative? How does this work? People talked about containment of China. Have they spent any time in Asia? I mean, that just won't work, okay? And even concepts of balance of power. What does that mean in a world where you've got coronavirus or proliferation or other topics? So we have to be smart in try to how, and at the same time, have constant feedback loops because people will miss things. So let me close with one other point, just so since we've got this captive audience. One of the things I've done over the past 3 years is after I read Kissinger's book, Diplomacy, 25 years ago, I liked the way he used history to talk about foreign policy, but I thought it was very much written from a European perspective. So was thinking about how to try to write something that had the American story. So I will have a book coming out in August called America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. And my approach is to take stories and mini biographies about people and events. And it focuses on a little bit of this, to answer the last question, a pragmatism. So the question was asked, what makes me optimistic? I'm not necessarily optimistic or pessimistic. I'm just pragmatic about how to try to deal with these issues. So the first chapter is with Paris, with Ben Franklin. We have a lot of chapters interacting with Britain over the course of the years. And my idea was to try to use color and narrative and stories to talk about the ideas and traditions in American foreign policy. And frankly, it fits into your other rubric, which is my thought will be US foreign policy will change. After Trump, whenever that occurs, people will have to rethink these things. And in some ways, it's useful not just to look at the Cold War era, but look at some of the aspects of America's relations with the world for the 150 years before 1947, 49.
That's been tremendous. You can't see it, but we have well over 100 people that have stayed an extra 25 minutes. And most importantly, you have. This has been extraordinary. You are a giant on the global stage, both in terms of the work you've done, in terms of your thinking. I'm very happy that you've already volunteered to have another session in the Chatham House Global Trade Policy Forum. That's very important to us. We will take you up on that. I want to thank AIG, Clifford Chance, Diageo, EY. We really couldn't do this work without you. Stay with us. It's tremendously important. I really mean that. I know Robin means that. And Jim, I want Robin and Jim to say a final word. We all wanted you here. This is phenomenal for all of us. What you can't see is that we have Isabel Hilton, Philip Stevens. We have so many people, Peter Westmacott, who are still on the call right here with you. So it really is a tremendous service for us. And I genuinely mean that. I hope that you will stay engaged with this project, with our work intellectually for a very long time to come, but also in the short and medium term. But Robin, I know you want to say a word, and then Jim. Thank you, Bob.
Well, Bob, as we're all still on the call and been enjoying it so much, not even noticing time go by, I would just say very quickly, the kind of pragmatic, thoughtful approach that you brought throughout your talk, and which I think will be reflected in the book that you're about to produce, is not just important in America. It's a voice that we've got to make sure is also heard in Europe, and I would say in the UK as well, because we're all getting wrapped up at the moment in a much more intense kind of dialogue, one that I think is not always going to pick the national interested approach or the self-interested approach. So really appreciate your time, especially in our centenary year. I think you brought that kind of historical perspective, which this year, above all years, we need to make sure that we give real time to. So I will hand over to my chairman, Jim O'Neill.
And I should insert from Mary Dejevsky, it's a pity that Zoom has no option for applause. So we'll figure that one out, but it's certainly there waiting for you, Jim.
Can you hear that? Bob, what can I say? As you know, I generally tend to be one of life's relatively cheerier people, or certainly over most of the time we've known each other. And I even managed to persuade myself about 4 weeks ago that we would get through phase 1 of coronavirus, maybe with not as much horror as so many people have been worrying about. But my optimism was ruined by Donald Trump earlier this week. And it's been an absolute pleasure to listen to you as a voice of reason. And I just pray that you can influence some of your colleagues in DC and elsewhere to see the world as a win-win game, and particularly to get back to the glory days of international cooperation that you so beautifully have represented. So thank you very much on behalf of Chatham House and all our clients for spending so long for us and everything you do for the world.
Well, thanks for inviting all my friends.
So if everyone wants to unmute Bob, we'll try. We'll give it a try. And Dan Nexon, it's great to see you on the call. Thank you, Bob. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for having me.